Welcome to Reaction. Today we're talking about the report into the UK government's handling of the COVID crisis, which was published by a joint select committee after an inquiry earlier this week. I'm joined by Alastair, Benn from Reaction. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. Alastair, what did you make of the report? Because it's interesting, it sort of landed, seemed to be a huge deal. It was a sort of 24-hour media storm. Do you think, there's that terrible phrase, lessons are being, lessons must be learned, so that, how Britain always responds to disasters and then moves on quickly. What did you make of it?
Two things that I think were sort of the two big stories that came out of it, I think are both do not reflect actually our experience with COVID fundamentally, but they reflect very powerful media narratives that have become very, very solidified over the last year. One was the argument over timings of the first lockdown.
Yeah.
Should we have gone into lockdown a week earlier, and how many lives would then have been saved in sort of raw numbers? And it's, the argument is, we could have saved X number of lives by doing this intervention then. I don't think that's one. There are two reasons why that is it's a flawed way of looking at it. One, Raghib Ali, who's involved with the MRC Biostatistics unit in Cambridge, who does a lot of modelling COVID, has repeatedly said throughout the pandemic, every country that suppressed COVID sort of big time in the spring of March 2020 in April experienced worse COVID waves in the wintertime. So expressing, saying that X number of lives would have been saved at that moment is, it's not nuanced enough to reflect that, lives saved in March may well have contributed to worse health collapse in December. Yeah. And there is actually a lot of evidence that we experienced a very bad second wave because, to some degree, the health system, had serious difficulties. And so I find that. I also think it's not a good way of talking about death. We should talk about the way people die and whether those deaths that happened in March and April were people dying well, and I don't think they were, and that was because of lack of preparation, not enough resources.
Yeah.
The situation in care homes, and where I think a lot of people died alone because of the problems with PPE and all that, and because of the kind of emergency situation. These are the things we should be talking about, not political game point scoring on X number of deaths here versus X number of deaths there. The second aspect is, which I think the media took up from the report, is kind of the reflection that came out was, if we'd done an autumn lockdown that earlier, then we might have prevented what happened in December and January. I don't know what this amorphous autumn lockdown might have looked like. In Wales, the government did what Sage was suggesting, a circuit breaker lockdown in September for 2 weeks, and they experienced effectively the same winter wave, actually in more extreme form, because it rebounded very fast.
And there's a trade-off, right? I can understand the concern, and it was a terrible sort of second wave, but the reality is that school pupils had what was effectively a normal. They had, at least after all of the disruption, they had a sort of normal start to the school, normal-ish start to the school year, and were in school. Is the suggestion that actually we should have just completely cancelled in-person schooling? The schools wouldn't have returned in September because everyone would be into full lockdown that then finished, when? June, July?
Yeah.
The social costs of doing that would have been enormous. I suppose the thing that I thought the report landed very well and was very cleverly written, and I watched quite a bit of the evidence sessions, as I'm sure other people did. And I do think they got to the heart of some very important things. Essentially, the period that fascinates me, whether or not this in the end will make any difference in terms of deaths, as it kind of levels out across the Western world, and you'll see that over the course of 2-3 years, death rates are sort of broadly similar. I'm not predicting that, just I suspect that may turn out to be the case, no matter how you responded. But that's no defense of the system failure that happened, that Dominic Cummings has talked really quite eloquently about in February 2020, when you think back, I don't want to use the word stockpiling, but we were, you, me, all sorts of people were quietly just sort of building up some resilience and supplies at home, which actually just was not panic, but just turned out to be a sensible thing considering what happened in March and April. And the UK government, and I took false assurance from it, as I'm sure many people did. I wrote at the time, the government is following the science, which now seems an incredibly naive thing to have thought and to have written. But I did take comfort from the fact that we apparently had a very good pandemic plan on various academic studies. Britain had come, near a top or near the top in terms of pandemic preparedness. And then that horrible realization, which happens inside government, Cummings and others, Benn, Warner, various people realize it's preparedness for the wrong sort of pandemic. It's a plan for a flu style pandemic, not for what's coming. And then the scramble in March to make the Prime Minister realize this and wake up to it, which he does. And there's a 6-week period there where, from really Brexit night, 31st of January 2020, through to the middle of March, where the government machine is just not functioning properly. The Prime Minister isn't there for large parts of it. And I know ministers say, well, he didn't have to be at Cobra, but he is actually away doing whatever he's doing at critical points, and exhausted after the election. If you were looking for defenses of Boris Johnson, he was exhausted. Brexit had just happened, but he wasn't fully tuned in a way that, now some people say this wouldn't make any difference, but I think if you'd had a Thatcher or a Brown style figure in that February in position, asking questions, interrogate, and it's one of the main jobs of ministers is just to interrogate intelligently the official advice, to test the underlying assumptions. And if that had been done, we would have had a sort of 3 or 4 week head start in terms of preparing the health service, sourcing PPE, and then giving instructions to people, whether that's lockdown or not, but just avoiding gatherings, changes to behavior, some of which was happening naturally, wasn't it, in that month anyway. But the government could have then broadcast that and tried to alter behavior rather than doing it in a sudden rush as they realize they've got it wrong. Is that fair?
Yeah, if you don't think leadership matters in the British system, then you don't know about British political history. It is literally the main feature. It's a weakness of the British system, but it's also a strength when you get the right people in charge. The Prime Minister has an exceptional authority in the British system in normal times. In an emergency, he acquires even more authority. It is, it matters. If you look at any crisis in the last 100 years and you look at the response, the responses that have been judged by history has done well, whether there were, everything is mixed and there's shades of grey, it involves people at the top paying maximum attention, and having very, very clear systems which work fluidly and which, there's constantly going back and forwards. It's a kind of this idea of the supreme command where everything is flowing back through the Prime Minister and out again through a dedicated group around him. This is what Gordon Brown managed to do in the financial crash, and it's what lots of prime ministers have been able to do. I'm sorry, but Boris, whatever his strengths, didn't do that, let's be honest. And that was what actually created the moral tragedy of March and April, which is people different bits of the government sending people actually to their deaths because of the dysfunction. So care homes and hospitals and people being shunted around, the Nightingales being built for no reason, as it turned out. All these different bits are explained by a lack of, that peculiar authority and the people around him not being able to do it. Boris got ill, of course he did. That was terrible. He almost died. Enormous sympathy, but he wasn't ill for most of the crisis time,
February and March.
And that no one was able to step up is actually a judgment on his leadership style. A guy who cannot tolerate strong ministers, who or hasn't been able to, has appointed lots of people who he sees, I think, as people who are not threats. And I think, is that fair? Maybe that's a harsh judgment, but I think, was it Raab took over, who apparently was good at chairing meetings? Well, that's not a skill. That's a skill in a normal time. That's a good thing, but it's not the skill we're looking for in an emergency.
It was.
I think you're right. Is the report does get into that stuff, and it's very illuminating. But it's not stuff that any intelligent observer or someone who has read the runes, in terms of what Dominic Cummings, who was at the centre of it, has been saying, can work out. And we are going to have crises in the next 10 years that are significant, and we need better leaders, and we need better people at top.
There's a full public inquiry to come, of course, but what happened this week is, of course, a start. You've been watching Reaction with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, and my colleague Alastair. Benn, if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just click the subscribe button, and also like the video if you do like the video. And you can also subscribe to Reaction to get my weekly newsletter and all of the brilliant work of the team. You also get columnists like Tim Marshall writing weekly on geopolitics and Maggie Pagano on business. The link is below, and become a Reaction subscriber. In October, you also get a free welcome gift, which is the new George III biography by Andrew Roberts, which is a brilliant book, sent to you as a gift when you take out an annual membership. So until next time, thank you very much for watching.